The snow fell soft and silent over Redgrave, West Virginia, on Christmas Eve, 1948. Inside the weathered two-story house on Mill Creek Road, the Harwick family celebrated with the kind of exhausted joy that comes from surviving another hard year. 12 people crowded into rooms that smelled of pine and cinnamon, their voices rising in familiar songs while the radio crackled with distant carols. Reginald Harwick watched his children from his armchair by the fire, a cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. 10 children total, though the eldest, Thomas, was spending the holiday with his new wife's family across the state line. The others ranged from 21-year-old Calvin down to 3-year-old Iris, who'd already fallen asleep on her mother's lap. "Papa, tell us about the old country," 15-year-old Marcus said, sprawled on the floor with his younger siblings. "About the mountains." Reginald's wife, Pauline, shot him a warning look. She didn't like when he spoke of Sicily, of the reasons they'd left. But it was Christmas, and the firelight made him nostalgic for stories, even the dark ones. "The mountains there aren't like these mountains," Reginald began, his accent still thick after 20 years in America. "In Sicily, we have had old families, old debts, old ways of settling scores." "Reg," Pauline warned, but he waved her off. "I'm just telling stories, Cara. The children should know where they come from." He looked at Marcus, at 13-year-old Helena, at 10-year-old Arthur, 9-year-old Dorothy, and 7-year-old Beatrice. These 5 had been born in Italy, remembered fragments of the crossing. "There was a man," Reginald continued, voice dropping to that storytelling register, "who came to me before we left. He said certain people were displeased with my politics, that I should reconsider my loyalties or face consequences. I told him where he could shove his consequences. Calvin, the responsible one, shifted uncomfortably. "Papa, maybe we shouldn't." But Reginald was lost in memory now, smoke curling from his cigarette like question marks in the warm air. He said something strange as he left. He said, "One way or another, Harwick, you'll learn that some debts follow you across oceans. And children pay for their parents' pride." The room had gone quiet except for the fire's snap and pop. "That was 12 years ago," Reginald said finally. "We came here, built this house, raised American children. And that man, whoever he was," he stubbed out his cigarette, "he stayed in Italy where he belongs." But even as he said it, Reginald's mind turned to the stranger who'd appeared at the house 3 weeks ago, claiming to be selling life insurance. The man had been polite, professional, but when Reginald declined the policy, something had shifted in his expression. "You have many children, Mr. Harwick?" the man had said in flawless English with just the faintest hint of a Sicilian accent. "Accidents happen, especially in winter. Houses burn, ladders fail, trucks break down." Then he'd smiled. "But of course, these are just the normal concerns of family men, yes?" Reginald had said nothing about the visit to Pauline. What was there to say? The man could have been exactly what he claimed, an insurance salesman with unfortunate word choices and poor timing. Still, Reginald had checked the wiring twice since then, had made sure the fire extinguishers were filled, had test-driven both his trucks to ensure they'd start in an emergency. Now, watching his children settle in for the night, he told himself he was being paranoid. This was America. This was Christmas. They were safe. At midnight, Pauline finally shepherded the children upstairs. Calvin and his brother Vincent shared one room at the far end of the hall. Marcus, Helena, and Arthur claimed the middle bedroom. Dorothy and Beatrice bunked in the room closest to the stairs. The baby, Iris, slept in a crib in Reginald and Pauline's downstairs bedroom. The house settled into sleep slowly, floorboards creaking, wind whistling through gaps in the old windows. Reginald stayed up smoking, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The insurance man's words kept circling back. Houses burn, ladders fail, trucks break down. At 1:17 a.m., Pauline woke to the smell of smoke. She shook Reginald awake, and by the time they reached the bedroom door, flames had already consumed the living room. The fire moved with impossible speed, eating through walls that should have resisted, climbing drapes with a hunger that seemed almost deliberate. "The children!" Pauline screamed. Reginald tried the stairs, but the entire stairwell was a column of fire. He ran outside, intending to use the ladder they kept against the side of the house, the ladder he'd checked just last week. But it was gone. Dragged 50 feet down the embankment, he'd discover later, though he had no memory of moving it. He ran to his trucks. Neither would start. The batteries were dead, though both had been fine yesterday. Both. By the time Reginald smashed a window and crawled back inside, Pauline had already fled with baby Iris. Calvin had made it out, along with Vincent and 10-year-old Gilbert, who'd been sleeping in Calvin's room. But the others, Marcus, Helena, Arthur, Dorothy, and Beatrice, were still upstairs. Reginald tried twice more to reach them, burning his hands on the doorframe, inhaling smoke that tasted of chemicals he couldn't name. The fire wasn't behaving right. It moved in directions fire shouldn't move, as if guided by some malevolent intelligence. A neighbor called the fire department, but the single fire truck took over 2 hours to arrive. The chief later claimed he hadn't been home, had needed to wait for someone who could drive the truck. The excuse was thin, implausible. By dawn, the house had collapsed into its basement, a smoking ruin that smelled of burned wood and something else, something chemical and wrong. The fire marshal conducted a brief inspection and declared the cause to be faulty wiring. Reginald tried to tell him about the rewiring he'd done just 6 months ago, about the insurance man's threats, about the missing ladder and the dead truck batteries, but the marshal dismissed him as a grief-stricken father looking for someone to blame. A cursory search of the ashes produced nothing. No bones, no teeth, no trace of 5 children who should have left some remains even in the hottest fire. The local coroner, who hadn't actually examined the scene, issued death certificates anyway. Cause of death: fire or suffocation. One of the jurors who signed off on the findings was a local businessman who'd been heard muttering about foreign troublemakers and how Reginald should have kept his mouth shut about politics. Against the fire marshal's explicit orders, Reginald rented a bulldozer 4 days later and covered the site with earth. He couldn't bear looking at the ashes of what was supposed to be his children's grave. But in his heart, he didn't believe they'd died there. The fire had been too fast, too perfect. The complete absence of remains too convenient. Detective Ruth Mercer arrived in Redgrave on a gray November afternoon 3 years later, chasing a lead that probably wouldn't pan out. She specialized in cold cases, the ones that kept good cops awake at night, and the Harwick fire had all the hallmarks of something deeply wrong beneath the official explanation. She'd been hired privately by Pauline Harwick, who'd scraped together money from her seamstress work to afford even a few days of professional investigation. The woman who answered the door looked 20 years older than her 48 years, eyes haunted by questions that would never be answered. "You really think they're still alive?" Pauline asked after Ruth had settled at the kitchen table, notes spread before her. "I think the official story doesn't make sense," Ruth said carefully. 5 children died in that fire, but there's no physical evidence. Fire doesn't cremate bodies completely, Mrs. Harwick. Especially not a house fire that burned for less than 2 hours. There should have been bones, teeth, something. Reginald entered from the back room, moving like a man much older than his 56 years. The fire had broken something in him, Ruth could see. He carried a newspaper clipping, his hands trembling slightly. "A woman in Charleston," he said, sitting heavily, "claims she saw them 2 weeks after the fire. 5 children matching their descriptions in a car with 2 men. She tried to approach, but the car drove away." Ruth had read that report. She'd also read a dozen others like it, sightings in Kentucky, Ohio, even as far as Pennsylvania. None had been verified. Most were probably well-meaning people who saw what they wanted to see. But some of the details bothered her. The Charleston witness had described Helena's distinctive birthmark before anyone published that information. Another sighting in Lexington mentioned Arthur's habit of touching his ear when nervous, again, not public knowledge. A gas station attendant in Morgantown claimed the eldest girl had whispered, "Help us," before being dragged back to the car by a man with a Sicilian accent. Each witness had stopped talking after receiving visits from men claiming to be police but showing no identification. The gas station attendant was found dead in his apartment, officially ruled a suicide despite having no history of depression. "Tell me about the insurance man," Ruth said. Reginald's jaw tightened. "I told the police. They said he was checked out, that the insurance company had record of sending someone to our address that day. But the company sent me a letter later, apologizing for the confusion. They said they'd sent someone the week before, not the day I reported. The man who came to my door that November day, they have no record of him." Ruth made a note. "And the fire chief? Morris died last year. Heart attack." Reginald's voice was flat. Very sudden. Very convenient for him, not having to answer questions anymore. Ruth spent 2 more days in Redgrave, interviewing neighbors, reviewing fire department records, examining the site where the house had stood. The Harwicks had converted it to a memorial garden, flowers marking the spot where each bedroom had been. What she found confirmed her suspicions without providing any answers. The fire had moved in patterns consistent with accelerants, though none were found in testing. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a black car parked on the road above the house in the hours before the fire. A car no one recognized, with plates no one could recall. The telephone lines had been cut, though the phone company's report attributed it to storm damage despite clear skies that night. And then there was the photograph. A local shopkeeper mentioned it casually, describing a tourist who'd bought film at his store the morning of December 25, 1948. The man had been talkative, mentioned taking pictures at a fire scene the night before. Said he collected photos of disasters, the shopkeeper recalled. Thought it was real odd, coming to our town just to photograph a house fire. Ruth traced the film development to a shop in Charleston. After considerable effort and some money changing hands, she obtained copies of photographs developed that week for a man matching the description. Most were innocuous, Christmas decorations, snow scenes, local businesses. But 3 photographs made her blood run cold. The first showed 5 children in a car, their faces pressed against the windows. The photo was slightly out of focus, taken at night, but the resemblance to the Harwick children was unmistakable. The second showed the same car from a different angle, revealing 2 men in the front seat. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but one wore a ring visible on his raised hand. A distinctive signet ring with a crest Ruth couldn't quite make out. The third photograph was the most disturbing. It showed the Harwick house, fully engulfed in flames, but the timestamp on the negative indicated it had been taken at 11:47 p.m., a full hour and a half before Pauline woke to find the fire. Ruth stared at that photograph for a long time in her motel room, trying to find an explanation that didn't lead where her mind kept going. Could the timestamp be wrong? Could the photographer have simply gotten lucky, anticipating where he'd be able to capture the fire? Or had he known because he'd helped set it? She brought the photographs to the Harwicks the next morning, watching their faces as they studied the images. Pauline's hands shook so badly she could barely hold them. "That's them," she whispered. "That's Helena's coat, Arthur's cap. That's my babies." But were they? Ruth had seen enough desperate families to know how easily grief could transform ambiguous images into certainty. The faces in the photograph were blurred, could be any children of roughly the right ages. "The ring," Reginald said suddenly, pointing at the second photograph. "I've seen that ring before." "Where?" "The insurance man. He wore it. I noticed because it was unusual, looked old, expensive. Not the kind of thing a salesman usually wears." Ruth took the photograph back, studied it under her magnifying glass. The signet ring bore a crest. She could just make out a crown over crossed keys. Sicilian nobility, if she had to guess. Or perhaps organized crime families who'd adopted noble symbols for their own purposes. She spent her last day in Redgrave making calls, pulling favors from contacts in New York and Philadelphia where Italian organized crime had firmer roots. The description of the ring, the mention of Sicilian accents, Reginald's political history, it all pointed in one direction. But proving it was another matter entirely. Late on her final night, Ruth sat with the Harwicks in their kitchen, trying to find words that wouldn't destroy them further. "I believe your children were taken," she said finally. "I believe the fire was set deliberately to cover the kidnapping. I believe there were people who wanted to punish you, Mr. Harwick, for your political statements. Taking your children. That's the kind of vengeance that certain families specialize in. But you can't prove it, Reginald said. No. And even if I could, the people involved are likely protected. Connected. The kind of men who don't face consequences for their actions. Pauline was weeping silently, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Are they alive? Ruth hesitated. This was the question she'd been dreading, because she genuinely didn't know the answer. If they were taken for revenge, possibly. They might have been placed with families, adopted out, or given new identities. Or, she didn't finish, didn't need to. The Harwicks knew what the alternative was. But the photograph, Pauline pressed, that was taken after the fire. They were alive then. If the photograph is genuine, yes. But Mrs. Harwick, that was 3 years ago. A lot can happen in 3 years. Ruth left Redgrave the next morning with more questions than answers. The photographer had never been identified. The men in the car never found. The insurance man vanished like smoke. 15 years later, Pauline Harwick received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a man in his late 20s, standing outside a diner somewhere in the South. She could tell by the palm trees in the background. On the back, someone had written a single word, Arthur. The man in the photograph had Arthur's jawline, his stance, the way he held his shoulders slightly hunched. But he was older, scarred, changed. He could be Arthur, could be a stranger, could be cruel joke. Reginald hired investigators, spent money they didn't have tracking the photograph's origin. It had been mailed from Kentucky, processed through a distribution center that handled mail from 6 states. Other families in similar situations received similar photographs over the years, always of young adults who might be the missing children, always from nowhere, never verifiable. Reginald and Pauline built a billboard along Route 16, displaying photographs of all 5 children with the question, "What happened to them?" It stood for 40 years until after both parents had died. Sometimes, late at night in Redgrave, older residents still talk about the Harwick fire. They mention the strange sound some claimed to hear that night. Not just fire and collapsing timbers, but voices calling from inside the flames. Others remember the black car seen around town for weeks afterward. There are theories, of course. Kidnapping, organized crime revenge, cover-ups involving local officials. Even stranger ideas, witness protection, voluntary disappearance, supernatural intervention. But theories aren't truth. And the truth, if it exists anywhere, remains locked in the memories of people who chose silence over justice. Ruth Mercer, long since retired, keeps a file in her home office. Inside are photographs, statements, the evidence she accumulated over years of half pursuing a case she could never quite let go. She's in her 80s now, and sometimes she wakes from dreams where 5 children press their faces against car windows, mouths forming words she can't quite hear. In the dreams, she runs toward them, but the car is always pulling away. And in the distance, houses burn with flames that smell wrong, that move with purpose, that consume everything except the one thing that might have provided answers. The bodies of children who were there and then weren't, who died and maybe didn't. The site where the Harwick house stood is empty now, the memorial garden long overgrown. New owners have talked about building there, but something always stops them. Financing falls through, permits get denied, workers report feeling uneasy on the property. And sometimes on Christmas Eve, when the snow falls soft and silent over Redgrave, people claim they can see lights in windows that don't exist anymore, can hear children singing carols in a house that burned 77 years ago. But that's just small-town legend, the kind of story people tell to make tragedy feel more mysterious than meaningless. Isn't it?
If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.